January 17th, 1945. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow falls without sound. Thick flakes drift through skeletal trees, settling on the frozen earth like ash from a cold fire. Somewhere in the gray distance, artillery rumbles, a bass note that never quite resolves. The air smells of pine sap, diesel exhaust, and something metallic that tankers learn to recognize. The scent of steel under stress, oil seeping through cold welds, the ghost of cordite clinging to barrel vents. In a clearing 200 meters wide, a tiger sits like a cathedral of armored plate, 56 tons of Krupp steel, an 88-millimeter gun that can punch through 3 inches of armor at 2,000 meters. Inside, 5 men breathe the recycled air of enclosed spaces, leather, sweat, machine oil, the faint copper taste of adrenaline. Oberfeldwebel Hans Schaefer touches the breech of the main gun the way a man might touch a talisman. He has survived Kursk, survived Normandy, survived the killing fields of France. The Tiger has become more than a weapon. It has become proof of German engineering, German will, the superiority that propaganda promised, and this machine seemed to deliver. Through the periscope, he watches 5 shapes emerge in the tree line. Shermans. He almost smiles. The Sherman M4 entered American service in 1942 with the burden of arriving late to a war that had already redefined armored warfare. By the time the first battalions rolled off the assembly lines in Detroit and Grand Blanc, German tankers had spent 3 years refining the brutal calculus of the Eastern Front. They had learned to kill Soviet T-34s at ranges where infantry couldn't even see the target. They had learned that armor superiority wasn't theory. It was life measured in millimeters of steel and the velocity of tungsten core shells. The Sherman was none of the things the Wehrmacht had come to respect. Its frontal armor measured 51 millimeters at the thickest point, barely adequate against the new generation of German anti-tank weapons. Its 75-millimeter gun, effective against earlier Panzers, struggled against the sloped armor of Panthers and the fortress-like hides of Tigers. American crews called it the Ronson after the cigarette lighter because of how quickly it caught fire when penetrated. British tankers, with their characteristic gallows humor, called it the Tommy Cooker. German intelligence reports from 1943 described the Sherman as numerically threatening but technically inferior. Panzer tacticians developed doctrine around this assessment. Engage at range. Use the 88-millimeter superior penetration to destroy American armor before it could close to effective distance. One Tiger could theoretically hold a sector against 10 Shermans if the terrain favored long sight lines. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. The Tiger's frontal armor, 102 millimeters well-sloped, could shrug off the Sherman's 75-millimeter shells at any range beyond point blank. The 88 could kill a Sherman from positions where return fire was merely a gesture of defiance. German training manuals feature comparative silhouettes. The squat, boxy Sherman next to the predatory profile of the Tiger. The message was clear without being stated. American industry could build quantity, but German engineering had achieved quality. Hans Schaefer had absorbed these lessons through 2 years of combat. He had seen Shermans burn from hits that barely scorched his Tiger's paint. He had watched entire American platoons halt and withdraw when a single Tiger appeared on a ridgeline. The psychological impact was almost as valuable as the tactical advantage. The Tiger didn't just destroy enemy armor. It created hesitation, fear, the kind of doubt that turns engagements into routes. So when 5 Shermans emerged from a tree lean that January morning, Schaefer's first thought was professional rather than concerned. Calculate range, select ammunition, determine firing sequence. His loader already had an armor-piercing round chambered. His gunner, Franz, was traversing the turret with a smooth mechanical precision of 10,000 practice hours. What none of them considered, in that crystalline moment before the engagement began, was that the Americans had stopped fighting the war the Germans expected. The concept arrived in a report that most Wehrmacht officers never read. It was buried in after-action summaries from France, buried deeper in the chaos of a collapsing front. American armored doctrine had evolved not through design, but through necessity. Outgunned in direct confrontation, American tankers had discovered what wolves knew instinctively. The lone hunter starves, but the pack feasts. They called it swarming. A Sherman platoon, typically 5 tanks, no longer approached German armor as 5 individual combatants. They moved as a single organism with distributed intelligence. The tactic was brutally simple. Spread wide, attack from multiple angles simultaneously, force the enemy to choose which threat to address while the others maneuvered into firing positions. A Tiger's armor might be impenetrable from the front, but its sides measured only 80 millimeters, its rear only 82. And while a Tiger could destroy one Sherman with a single shot, its turret's reverse speed was 6 degrees per second. A Tiger could rotate 90 degrees in 15 seconds. For minutes could feel like eternity when you were trying to keep 5 enemies in view. The American crews had learned something else, something that didn't appear in any technical manual. The Tiger's psychological advantage, that aura of invincibility, became a liability when the expected massacre didn't materialize. German tankers had been trained to expect American armor to retreat or die. They hadn't been trained for what happened when neither occurred. The first Sherman, hull number 3 to 9, commanded by Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, broke left at full speed. 30 miles per hour through snow and frozen mud, the Sherman's 4 JA V8 engines screaming through 8 cylinders of controlled detonation. The tank threw up a rooster tail of snow and dirt, presenting its frontal armor to the Tiger while angling toward the German tank's right flank. The second and third Sherman split right, mirroring the maneuver. Their commanders were already on the radio, calling positions, calling ranges, orchestrating the movement with the clipped efficiency of men who had rehearsed this dance until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. The fourth Sherman, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Hayes, drove straight forward, directly at the Tiger. 56 tons of German steel and 88 millimeter depth, and Hayes drove toward like a man approaching a church. His voice on the radio was Carolina calm. All units, for minutes. Mark time now. The 5th Sherman disappeared into the tree line. Inside the Tiger, Franz tracked the Sherman driving straight at them. Target, 12 o'clock, 800 meters. Schaefer's voice, fire. The 88 spoke with the voice of industrial thunder. The recoil rocked the Tiger back on its suspension. Through the smoke and snow, they watched the tracer arc across the clearing. A line of fire connecting hunter to prey. The shell hit Hayes' Sherman on the frontal glacis plate, exactly where the armor was thickest. The impact sounded like a cathedral bell struck with a sledgehammer. The Sherman shuddered, slewed slightly left, and kept coming. The shell had glanced off. Franz stared through the gun sight. Impossible. But it wasn't impossible. Hayes had angled his hull at exactly 32 degrees from the Tiger's firing line. The combination of slope and angle had been enough to defeat the 88's penetration. Not consistently. This was luck married to skill. But once was enough to buy time. And time was the only currency that mattered. The Tiger's loader slammed another round into the breach. Franz Travis right, tracking one of the Shermans moving along the flank. Target, 3 o'clock, 600 meters. The turret rotated, 6 degrees per second. 10 seconds to acquire the target. 10 seconds while Hayes' Sherman closed the 700 meters, while Kowalski's tank reached the edge of the clearing, while the Sherman in the trees moved to a position no one in the Tiger could see. The 88 fired again. This time the shell found its mark. Kowalski's Sherman erupted in a gout of orange flame that turned black within seconds. The ammunition cooked off, a secondary explosion that blew the turret 15 feet into the air. No one inside survived the first 3 seconds. 4 Shermans remaining. Hayes' voice on the radio, still calm. 3 minutes 20 seconds. The Tiger Travis left. The Shermans on the right flank had split up, forcing Franz to choose between targets. He picked the closer one, a decision made in the space between heartbeats, and fired. The shell hit low, penetrated the bogey wheels, and the Sherman ground to a halt, mobility kill but guns still active. 3 Shermans mobile. 1 immobilized. All 4 still in the fight. Hayes had closed to 400 meters. At this range, his 75mm gun had a theoretical chance of penetrating the Tiger's side armor if the angle was perfect. He fired. The shell ricocheted off the Tiger's frontal armor with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. Hayes' gunner was already loading the next round. The Tiger traversed back toward Hayes. Franz acquired the target, finger on the firing stud, and the fifth Sherman, the one that had disappeared into the trees, fired from the Tiger's right rear quarter. The shell, 75mm armor pacing, moving at 1,900 feet per second, hit the Tiger's rear engine deck at an angle just steep enough to penetrate the 82mm armor. The shell didn't detonate. It didn't need to. It punched through the engine housing and shattered the Maybach HL230 engine's crankcase. Superheated oil sprayed across internal components. The engine seized, then caught fire. Inside the Tiger, Claxon screamed. The smell of burning oil flooded the fighting compartment. Schaefer made the calculation in half a second. They had maybe 90 seconds before the fire reached the ammunition storage. Maybe less. Traverse left, tracked that Sherman in the trees. But the turret traverse were hydraulic, powered by the engine that was now dying. The turret moved, but slowly, 4 degrees per second instead of 6. Hayes closed to 300 meters. His gunner fired again, this time aiming for the Tiger's left track. The shell hit the drive sprocket and shattered it. The Tiger could no longer move, could barely rotate its turret. The immobilized Sherman, the one that had lost its mobility but not its gun, fired from the right flank. Its shell hit the Tiger's side armor 85mm thick. At 400 meters, with a perfect perpendicular angle, the 75mm shell penetrated. The tungsten core projectile punched through, struck the ready ammunition rack, and turned the Tiger's interior into a pressure vessel filled with explosive gas. Schaefer gave the order to abandon. His crew needed no encouragement. They were already moving, popping hatches, pulling themselves out of the steel coffin before it became a crematorium. 4 minutes and 12 seconds had elapsed since the Shermans entered the clearing. The after-action report filed by Lieutenant Hayes was characteristically terse. Engaged Tiger at 0847 hours. Enemy vehicle immobilized and destroyed using standard platoon tactics. 1 friendly KIA, 1 mobility kill. Continuing advance per operational orders. German intelligence recovered the Tiger 2 weeks later during a local counterattack. The technical examination report noted the catastrophic engine damage, the penetration of the side armor, the destroyed ready ammunition. The analyst who wrote the report included a section that circulated quietly through Panzer training school for the remainder of the war. The enemy has adapted tactics that negate our technological advantages. Individual vehicle superiority is meaningless against coordinated maneuver warfare. The psychological impact of the Tiger's reputation may have created overconfidence in crews accustomed to enemy withdrawal. When the expected pattern failed to manifest, response time was insufficient to address multiple simultaneous threats. In plainer language, the Americans had stopped being afraid. Fear is a weapon that cuts both ways. The Tiger had been designed not just to destroy enemy armor, but to dominate the psychological battlefield. Its reputation preceded it. Stories of invulnerability, of Shermans burning like matches, of entire American companies halted by a single Tiger holding crossroads. This wasn't propaganda. It was mathematical reality forged in Krupp steel and verified on 100 battlefields. But fear is sustainable only when the threat remains constant and overwhelming. The moment the mythology cracks, the moment the invincible predator bleeds, the relationship between hunter and hunted fundamentally changes. The Americans had bled. God, how they had bled. In Normandy, in the Falaise pocket, in the forest fighting around Aachen, Sherman crews had watched their friends burn in tanks that ignited like tinder. They had learned to hate the Tiger, to fear it, to respect it in the way soldiers respect anything that kills efficiently. And then they learned to kill it back. The lesson wasn't technological. The Sherman in January 1945 was essentially the same tank as the Sherman of June 1944. Some had upgraded guns, the 76mm that gave better penetration, but many still carried the original 75mm. The armor hadn't changed. The top speed hadn't changed. On paper, the Sherman remained inferior to the Tiger in every measurable category. But warfare isn't conducted on paper. What changed was doctrine, tactics, and the collective wisdom that emerges when men are forced to solve the problem of survival against superior equipment. The Americans industrialized a solution. They couldn't outbuild German quality, so they outthought it. They took the Sherman's genuine advantages, reliability, mobility, speed of production, and weaponized them through coordination. A single Sherman was a target. 5 Shermans moving with unified purpose became something the Tiger couldn't handle, a multidirectional threat that forced impossible choices. Engage the tank to your front and dive from the flanks. Engage the flanks and dive from the front. Try to kill them all and discover that 4 minutes isn't enough time when every second requires a decision, and every decision creates new vulnerabilities. The Germans had studied canny, had absorbed the lessons of double envelopment and superior tactics overcoming numerical advantage. They recognized the principle intellectually. But recognition isn't the same as adaptation, and adaptation isn't the same as acceptance. The Tiger crews couldn't accept that their steel cathedral might be fallible. The propaganda was too strong, the evidence too consistent. They had killed so many Shermans that the exceptions, the times when American tanks fought smart instead of dying cooperative deaths, registered as anomalies rather than emerging patterns. By the time the pattern became undeniable, Germany had lost a strategic initiative on every front. The Battle of the Bulge, where Schaeffer's Tiger met Hazy's Shermans, was Germany's last major offensive. It failed not because of insufficient armor. The Panzer Division committed to the Ardennes included hundreds of Panthers and Tigers, but because the tactical equation had changed in ways that armored superiority couldn't solve. The Americans brought more than tanks. They brought fuel, ammunition, spare parts, entire mobile repair shops that could rebuild a transmission in the field. They brought air superiority that turned German road movements into daylight suicide. They brought artillery in quantities that transformed terrain into moonscapes. And they brought a doctrine that accepted losses as the price of inevitable victory. The Sherman's weakness became a perverse strength. Because it was easier to build, easier to repair, easier to replace, American commanders could afford to use it aggressively. A Tiger was precious. Each one represented thousands of man-hours, specialized components, materials that Germany increasingly couldn't spare. Losing a Tiger was a strategic setback. Losing a Sherman was a Tuesday. This arithmetic of attrition wore down German armor through simple mathematics. By January 1945, Germany had produced approximately 1,350 Tigers across both the Mark I and Mark II models. America had produced more than 49,000 Shermans. Even if the kill ratio favored the Tiger 10-1, and it didn't, not anymore, the numbers told a story that no amount of Krupp steel could rewrite. Hans Schaefer survived the war. He spent 3 years in a POW camp in Oklahoma, working on farms, learning English from guards who treated him with a casual indifference that Americans reserve for defeated enemies who no longer pose a threat. He returned to Germany in 1948, to a country that no longer existed in the form he'd left it. The maps had been redrawn. The cities were rubble. The future was something to be rebuilt from ash and shame and the strange mercy of the Marshall Plan. He never spoke much about the war. When pressed, usually by younger generations who wanted to understand what it had been like, he would talk around the edges of experience, the cold, the fatigue, the peculiar boredom of military life punctuated by moments of existential terror. He didn't talk about ideology. By 1948, ideology was something best left in unmarked graves. But once, years later, interviewed for a documentary about armored warfare, he described that morning in the Ardennes. "We thought they would break," he said. His German was a clipped, precise German of an older generation. When the first Tiger appeared, American tanks usually withdrew. This was standard. We had learned to expect it. But these... He paused, searching for words. These did not withdraw. They came toward us. They came from all sides. It was like being in the center of a storm. You could kill one, but the others were already moving. We were very good. Our tank was excellent. But there were 5 of them, and they had decided they would not be afraid anymore. The interviewer asked if he thought the Sherman was a good tank. Schaefer considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The Sherman was not a good tank, he said finally, but it was a good enough tank, operated by men who learned to use it better than we learned to fight against it. That was sufficient. There's a museum in Belgium, not far from where the Ardennes Forest still grows dense and dark. In the collection, preserved with a reverence reserved for relics, sits a Sherman M4A1. The placard describes it as a typical example of American medium armor, mass-produced, reliable, the workhorse of the Allied advance through Western Europe. What the placard doesn't mention is that this particular Sherman, hull number 3 to 9, belonged to Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski. It was recovered from the clearing where Schaefer's Tiger made its last stand. The turret is missing, blown 15 feet into the air when the ammunition cooked off, but the hull remains largely intact. If you know where to look, you can see the scorch marks where fire consumed the interior in seconds. Next to it, separated by a velvet rope and 30 feet of museum floor, sits a tiger eye recovered from the same engagement, restored to mechanical perfection by enthusiasts who spent 20 years tracking down original parts. The 88mm gun is still capable of elevating and depressing. The armor still shows a pockmark where Sherman shells glanced off or penetrated. There's a hole in the rear engine deck, precisely 75mm in diameter, where the shot that killed it punched through. Tall groups gather around the Tiger. It's the draw, the attraction, the reason many visitors come. They take photographs standing next to the tracks, which come up to an adult's chest. They marvel at the engineering, the brutal functionality of German design. The tour guides explain the specifications, the armor thickness, the gun's penetration values, the kill ratios. Fewer people stop at the Sherman. It's less impressive, less photogenic. It looks exactly like what it is, a utilitarian tool, built for purpose rather than perfection. But if you stand in the museum when the crowds have thinned, when the light comes through the windows at an angle that catches the dust in the air, you can see them properly. The Tiger, magnificent and alone. The Sherman, ordinary and sufficient. And in the space between them, the invisible geometry of that January morning. 5 tanks against 1, for minutes from contact to conclusion, the moment when American armor stopped fighting the enemy's war and started winning their own. The mythology of armored warfare fixates on individual superiority. The Tiger is remembered because it embodied an ideal, the perfect weapon, scientifically designed, capable of dominating any battlefield through pure technical excellence. It's a seductive narrative. It confirms comfortable assumptions about the relationship between quality and victory. But wars aren't won by individual vehicles. They are won by systems, logistics, doctrine, industrial capacity, the ability to learn from failure and adapt faster than the enemy can exploit success. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II by any technical metric, but it was the right tank for the army that deployed it, operated within a system that understood how to leverage its strengths and mitigate its weaknesses. The German obsession with technical perfection became a strategic liability. The Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering that required specialized parts, skilled labor, and resources Germany couldn't spare. Each Tiger took twice as long to build as a Panther, 5 times as long as a Sherman. Maintenance was complex, fuel consumption was prodigious, and mechanical reliability was sufficient in theory but problematic in practice. American doctrine accepted imperfection as a design feature. The Sherman was designed to be good enough, cheap enough, simple enough that it could be produced by automobile factories converted to war production. It could run on gasoline or diesel. Its engine was an off-the-shelf Ford design. Its transmission was simple enough that field mechanics could repair it. Its weaknesses were known, documented, and addressed not through redesign but through tactics. This was the fundamental difference. The Germans built tanks to win battles. The Americans built tanks to win wars. The distinction seemed subtle but proved decisive. A Tiger could dominate a single engagement, could hold a crossroads against overwhelming force, could create tactical situations where German skill and German engineering achieved local superiority. But tactical victories accumulated into strategic defeat when the enemy could absorb losses and return with more tanks, more ammunition, more fuel, more everything. The Americans didn't need to build a better tank than the Tiger. They needed to build enough tanks to make the Tiger's superiority irrelevant. And they needed to develop tactics that transformed quantity into a quality of its own. Swarming was a tactical expression of strategic abundance. 5 Shermans attacking in coordination weren't 5 individual tanks. They were a weapons system that could overcome armored superiority through geometry and speed. The Tiger's advantages, its gun, its armor, became less decisive when forced to engage multiple simultaneous threats. The psychological impact reversed. The Americans stopped seeing the Tiger as invincible and started seeing it as a target that required multiple approaches and coordinated fire. This shift in perception mattered more than the tactical innovation itself. Once American crews internalized that the Tiger could be killed, that their Shermans could survive if operated intelligently, the fear that had given German armor much of its psychological power began to dissipate. The Tiger was still dangerous, Respect for the 88 never disappeared, but danger isn't the same as invincibility. On the morning of January 17, 1945, in a clearing in the Ardennes Forest, 5 American tankers made a series of decisions that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. One of them died. Another lost his tank. The remaining 3 destroyed a Tiger Eye and continued advancing. The engagement didn't change the war. By January 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable, determined by production figures and casualty rates and the cold mathematics of attrition. One Tiger more or less made no strategic difference. But the engagement represented something that transcended strategy. It was proof that technical inferiority could be overcome through adaptation, coordination, and the simple refusal to accept that superior equipment guaranteed superior outcomes. The Americans didn't beat the Tiger by out-engineering it. They beat it by outthinking it, by recognizing that warfare was a problem with multiple solutions, and the enemy's solution wasn't the only one that worked. There's a certain poetry to this. The Tiger represented the apex of a certain kind of military thinking, the idea that excellence in design and superiority in equipment could overcome numerical disadvantage. This wasn't wrong. Exactly. It had worked for Germany early in the war, when superior tanks and superior tactics allowed smaller German forces to achieve stunning victories against numerically superior enemies. But the Americans learned. They learned from Kasserine Pass, where German armor slaughtered inexperienced American units. They learned from Sicily, from Italy, from Normandy. They learned that they couldn't out-Tiger the Tiger, so they stopped trying. They built what they could build, shipped it across an ocean, and figured out how to use it in ways that German doctrine hadn't anticipated. This adaptive capability, the willingness to discard what didn't work and iterate toward what did, became America's true asymmetric advantage. Not the Sherman itself, but the system that produced it and the doctrine that evolved around it. The tank was just steel. The system was learning, institutionalized at a scale that Germany, with its static doctrine and resource constraints, couldn't match. By the time the war ended, American armor had evolved to a point where the question of individual tank superiority had become almost quaint. The M26 Pershing, deployed in the final months, could match the Tiger on technical grounds. But it barely mattered. The war had been won by Shermans. Thousands of Shermans, operated by crews who had learned to kill Tigers through speed, coordination, and the collective wisdom of survival. The snow still falls in the Ardennes every winter. The forest has reclaimed most evidence of the battles fought there. You can walk through clearings where men died without ever knowing it. The earth has absorbed the blood and the oil and the spent brass, has covered the scars with new growth. In the museum, the Tiger and the Sherman sit in climate-controlled silence. Tourists take photographs. Historians argue about penetration values and armor thickness, and whether the Sherman was adequate or merely adequate enough. The debates are endless, technical, largely beside the point. Because the real lesson of that January morning wasn't about tanks. It was about adaptation, about the difference between perfection and sufficiency, about what happens when quantity learns to think like quality. 5 Shermans entered a clearing. 1 Tiger waited for them. 4 minutes later, the Sherman crews were advancing and the Tiger was burning. The mathematics was simple. The implications were profound. In the end, the Americans didn't need to build a better Tiger. They just needed to stop fighting like the Germans expected them to fight. They needed to recognize that the enemy's terms weren't the only terms, that technical inferiority wasn't destiny, that coordination and adaptation could overcome armor plate and the most sophisticated gun in the European theater. The Tiger was a masterpiece. The Sherman was a tool. And wars, it turned out, were won by men who understood the difference, who recognized that a tool wielded with intelligence and courage could defeat a masterpiece operated within doctrine that couldn't adapt fast enough. That's what Hans Schaefer understood. Sitting in Oklahoma, watching American farmers work land that stretched to horizons he'd never imagined. That's what the museum visitors miss, standing beside the restored Tiger, marveling at its brutal elegance. That's what Lieutenant Hayes never needed to articulate, driving his Sherman forward while his friends died, and the impossible thing in front of him suddenly became possible through violence and coordination, and 4 minutes of perfect execution. The weak tank won. Not because it was secretly strong, but because weakness is only permanent if you accept the terms that define it. The Americans changed the terms. They rewrote the mathematics. They transformed 5 vulnerable targets into a single distributed weapon that could kill the unkillable. And the tiger burned, and the war continued, and the lesson echoed forward through decades of military doctrine. Excellence is not enough. Adaptation is everything. And the tiger that cannot learn to fear the wolf deserves what the wolf pack brings. The snow falls without sound. The forest remembers nothing. But the story survives, carved into armor plate, preserved in after-action reports, whispered through the halls of armor schools where young tankers still learn that sometimes a better tank loses, and sometimes that's exactly how it should be. 4 minutes, 5 Shermans, 1 tiger. The mathematics were simple. The implications were everything.